Welcome to part 2 of my communication miniseries. In the last episode, I covered the reaction cycle most of us go through when something happens, and how to handle someone whose emotions are running a little bit high. If you haven't listened to it yet, I recommend pausing this episode and listening to that one first, because today's episode builds off of that one. Now, today I'm talking about the other major area people get stuck on, which is their thinking. So, if you want to level up your conflict resolution and persuasion skills, then this is the episode for you. You're listening to This Is How You Think, the show that remodels your mindset. I'm your host, Jewel Kim. Let's dive in. As a coach who works with one-on-one clients every week, I get to see how people think up close and personal. And from everything I've observed, whatever we're thinking about any situation or other people or ourselves, our thoughts are the reason for how we act. So if you think about this, that means what you do or say, the choices you make, are all because of whatever you were thinking. And the same is true for every person you know. We're all saying or doing things because of the thoughts we're having, either consciously or subconsciously. And maybe you're thinking, well, like, duh, isn't this obvious? Or maybe you land on the other side where this feels kind of abstract. So let me give you an example. I recently gave a virtual workshop on communication, and I posed a scenario for the attendees because it's one of my favorite things to do with groups of people. And the scenario I gave them was, you and a colleague worked on a campaign together. You did most of the strategy. In the client meeting, your colleague presented the work as theirs. So in the workshop, I had someone role play as the person who did all of the work. Let's call them Sam. Sam approaches his colleague and expresses that they have a problem with what happened in the client meeting. So we have two characters, Sam and colleague, in a conversation about this, and Sam isn't happy. So the rest of the attendees and I came up with different responses to try with Sam. The first response was, we're on the same team. I asked Sam how she felt about that, and she immediately said, no, that was my credit. I did the hard work. I understand that we're on the same team, but that credit is mine to take, not yours. I would feel hurt and betrayed. The next response we tried was, well, you should feel flattered. When I asked Sam how she felt about that one, that got a flat no. And honestly, I don't blame her. I remember several years ago, this happened with someone I used to be friends with. And when I talked to her about this and said it didn't make me feel good to see her passing off my ideas as her own, this is literally how she responded, that I should feel flattered. And I remember feeling so freaking confused because I was like, well, she's my friend and I trust my friend. Something feels fishy right now, but I don't know. Maybe I should feel flattered, but I don't. So maybe there's something wrong with me. Maybe I'm the crazy one. Yeah, I was actually really confused about that. And it took me a while to resolve that and figure out all of what I was feeling and what was wrong with that situation. All I knew was I didn't feel good. And when I look back on that moment, sometimes I get a little disappointed in myself back then, but I also know that you don't know what you don't know, right? So back then, in the moment, I just let it drop. Anyway, back to the workshop. The third response with Sam, we said, oh my gosh, I'm so sorry. That was never my intention. What can I do to make this right? This is where it got really interesting because when I asked Sam, how do you feel now? She said she didn't feel any different. And I was like, really? Wait. This person's extending an olive branch and you're saying that wouldn't change how you feel towards them at all? Sam says no. So I thought this was actually a really great live example because It shows how, for some people, once trust is broken, it can be really hard to get that back. I follow up and I ask Sam, well, how come? And she says she wanted to understand why someone would do that. How did this happen? And as she's talking, she also says, I think what you did was wrong, and you know what you did was wrong. As soon as I heard that, I was like, bingo, that was it. That was the thinking we had to address. So I tried this next response. Oh my gosh, I never meant to do that. I just got so excited about talking about the project to the client, I didn't even realize I did that. I paused here and asked Sam how she felt after hearing this, and this is when her feelings started to change. Sam said it helped her feel better and she was more willing to move forward. She appreciated the conversation and explanation instead of pretending like nothing happened. And of course, she still wanted acknowledgement of what went wrong and assurances that it wouldn't happen again, which of course is natural, because if you keep doing the same thing, then the apology is basically meaningless, right? Now, if we rewind the conversation here and go back to when Sam said, I think what you did was wrong, and you know what you did was wrong. That statement was like a flare gun in the middle of the night. It was practically screaming, hello, look over here. This is where the real problem is. She was basically saying that the colleague purposefully did something with the intent to screw Sam over. Because she felt like that was a deliberate act of malice, that earlier response of, oh my gosh, I'm so sorry, that wasn't my intent, how can I make this right? It just bounced right off. Sam was like, whatever. But when I changed the response to, oh my gosh, totally didn't mean to do that, didn't even realize I did that, I was just so excited, that was when her feeling finally started to change, because I addressed her thinking that the colleague had done this intentionally despite knowing this was wrong. It's moments like this when you're dealing with somebody who has some kind of problem and you want to de escalate the situation. It's always going to be one of these four things: what they see, what they think, the emotion they're having, or the words in the delivery. And honestly, it can get a little tricky because the thinking and emotion, especially, can be intertwined because your thoughts directly influence your emotions, and your emotions also influence your thoughts. Of the two, it can be hard to know which one to address first. So it really depends on who it is you're talking to. You gotta know your person. Some people lead with their emotions more, and other people are more in their heads and their thoughts. And in case you're wondering what's a thought, a lot of the time they're kind of like a story you're telling yourself. They're often almost like full on sentences that you're thinking at yourself, and they're commonly an interpretation of what just happened and might not be entirely factual. That's when thoughts can really add fuel to the fire. So, one good way to spot the thought that needs to be addressed is when the other person says something that isn't accurate or factually correct, and it seems embedded with their emotions. You can often tell when their thinking is a problem because you can almost see a straight line between their thoughts to their emotions in the moment. My easy test for problematic thinking is, did they say something that might not be true? And is this something that they're all fired up about? That's usually how I know. Now, when I get into these situations, there are usually three main approaches I take to address someone's thinking. The first is a reframe. A reframe is basically like, the glass isn't half empty, it's half full. It can often feel like, look on the bright side. This one, though, you have to be careful with because a reframe can come too soon. When people's emotions are unresolved, a reframe is a lot harder to land. But it works fabulously well when their emotions have started to settle down because now they're finally ready to see another perspective. The second approach is the accusation audit. If you've ever read Never Split the Difference by Chris Voss, he talks about this. is basically whatever you can tell that the other person is thinking, before they even say it, you say that thing. So, for example, when I tell people about my coaching packages, and if I'm looking at them and I can tell there's some sticker shock, then I'll just come right out and say, "You're probably thinking this is pretty expensive, and I don't blame you." A lot of people have said the same thing. The accusation audit is a really interesting technique because it allows you to surface the objections that they may have hidden under the surface that they might otherwise never share with you. But because now you've put it on the table, they're much more willing to talk about it. And this usually works really well in conflict resolution. Now, the third approach for me is actually my favorite, and it's a technique that I've developed myself. It's what I call coming to neutral. This is very much all about helping people ground themselves in the facts. And I know that doesn't sound sexy, but I find that most people swing back and forth between positive interpretations and then a negative interpretation. So their emotions tend to also swing back and forth, sometimes kind of wildly. These are usually the people who feel like they're not very even keeled. So for me, coming to neutral is really important because it helps you establish a firm anchor point that you can always return to and stop all the violent swinging back and forth by examining the facts of the situation. Here's an example of coming to neutral. If someone says, "Well, you're batshit crazy," and then you immediately think, "Oh my gosh, they don't like me," or you're like, "Oh, they're such a jerk." Or maybe you're even thinking, "Gosh, they must be really insecure." My answer to that is always, well, how do we know any of those things are true? And of course, when I'm working with my clients, I get all kinds of reasoning for why these are true. And I'm like, okay, well, let's imagine we're in a court of law. How much of this can you actually prove? And that's when things usually get fun because it's almost impossible to prove someone is a jerk or to prove that someone doesn't like you unless they come into the courtroom and actually say those things about you, which, usually doesn't happen. So in a court of law, all you can actually prove is that they said the words, "You're batshit crazy." Every time I have clients really practice coming to neutral, it helps them turn down the heat on their emotions. And once you ground your emotions, you can start to see things differently. And you'll even immediately feel the shift inside of you on how you feel about that other person. All right, that's it for this week. If you have any questions, feel free to text the link in the description. And as a reminder, if you text that link, I do not see your phone number. All it does is let me text you back once for every text you send me. Or reach out to me on LinkedIn and send me a message. I love it when people send me messages about any of my episodes. As always, thank you so much for listening. And remember, I believe in you. See you next time.